Billionaire didn't know he had 8-year-old triplets until he met them at his wife's grave. Before starting to watch this story, tell us in the comments section from which city you're watching this story. Let's enjoy this story. The sky over Portland, Oregon, was gray and moody, the clouds hanging low like they too were mourning. Rain drizzled lightly, soaking the edges of the fresh grave as a small crowd stood around it, most holding umbrellas. Ethan Reeves stood in the back, tall and composed in a sleek black coat, with a silence so heavy it echoed louder than the murmurs of prayer. He hadn't seen Clara in nearly 9 years. Their last conversation had ended with her walking away, suitcase in hand, eyes filled with a strange mix of pain and defiance. She never reached out again. And now here he was, attending her funeral, watching her coffin slowly disappear into the ground as if she were just another chapter closing without a final paragraph. The priest continued with a soft, emotionless prayer, and Ethan stared ahead, but his thoughts were miles away. Regret pressed on his chest, but it wasn't sharp, not yet. He didn't know how to feel. Clara had been his wife. What? Briefly. The whirlwind romance that had begun during a tech conference in Seattle had ended just as fast. They married on impulse, argued endlessly, and separated after only 10 months. She'd said he was married to his ambition more than her. He hadn't disagreed. And now 9 years later she was dead. Cancer, someone had whispered. Fast, aggressive, silent. Just like her departure. As the final words were spoken, the crowd began to break apart slowly, people drifting toward the parking lot, dabbing their eyes. Ethan lingered. Something inside him told him to stay. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was unfinished grief. But then he noticed something strange, 3 small figures standing off to the side just beneath the bare maple tree. 3 children no older than 8, bundled in raincoats, each holding a small bouquet of white daisies. They approached the grave quietly, no adult in sight. Ethan watched, puzzled, as they knelt down, placed the flowers gently on the fresh soil, and whispered something he couldn't hear. Then the youngest-looking one turned slightly and glanced in his direction. Her light brown hair peeked from under her hood, and her eyes, Clara's eyes, froze him in place. She nudged the boy next to her and said something, and all 3 of them turned to look at Ethan. There was something disturbingly familiar in their gaze, like mirrors held up to a past he thought was buried. The boy on the right took a step forward. "Are you Ethan Reeves?" he asked in a soft voice, tilting his head the way Clara used to when she was trying to read someone's intentions. Ethan blinked. "Yes, and you are?" "I'm Drew. That's my sister, Riley, and my brother, Sam." He pointed to the other 2 kids who gave half nods but said nothing. "Our mom was Clara." Ethan felt the blood drain from his face. "I know. I knew your mother a long time ago. She said you were our dad," Riley said bluntly, her voice unwavering. There was a long pause. The rain felt heavier suddenly, or maybe that was just the weight of the words crashing down on him. Ethan looked at all 3 of them, searching for something, some hint that this was a misunderstanding. But it wasn't. Now that he was looking, he couldn't unsee it. The shared eyes, the arch of Drew's brow, the way Sam stood with his hands behind his back just like Ethan did when he was nervous. "She said we weren't supposed to bother you," Sam added quietly. "But we wanted to see you. She said you weren't a bad man. Just too busy." Ethan stepped back, momentarily dizzy. "She never told me. She never said anything about children." His voice cracked in the middle, so he stopped. The children looked at each other as if they were used to navigating awkward moments as a team. Then Riley, the boldest, walked up and took Ethan's hand in hers. It was cold and tiny but firm. "We're not asking for anything," she said. "We just wanted to meet you." Today felt like the right day. Ethan stood motionless, his heart thudding in a strange, foreign rhythm. In all his years of building companies, flying first class, winning awards and making headlines, nothing had ever knocked him off his feet like this. 3 children. His children. Born without his knowledge. Raised without his presence. And now here they were, showing up at a funeral like silent ghosts from a life he never knew he had. And somehow they weren't angry. They weren't bitter. They just looked curious, uncertain, a little sad and eerily patient. A woman in her 40s, holding a worn-out umbrella and wearing sensible shoes, finally appeared from behind the chapel and hurried toward them. "Kids, there you are. I told you not to wander off." She stopped when she saw Ethan. Her eyes widened slightly, and then her expression softened with reluctant understanding. "You must be Ethan. I'm Claire's friend, Denise. I took care of the kids while she was sick. I guess this moment was bound to happen." Ethan nodded slowly. He had 1,000 questions but no voice to ask them. Denise handed him a manila envelope. She wrote you a letter. About everything. She wanted me to give it to you if you ever came. She looked at the children and then back at Ethan. You might want to read it sooner rather than later. He took the envelope and looked down at it as if it were a bomb. Maybe it was. A bomb that would shatter the life he thought he understood. Riley squeezed his hand once more and then let go. We'll be at the hotel nearby if you want to talk later. Mom said to give you time. They walked away without drama, without begging for love or attention. Just quiet dignity like their mother. Ethan stood there alone, soaked in rain and regret, staring at the grave of a woman he once loved and the footprints of the 3 lives he never knew he helped create. Before going to next, please subscribe our channel, like and share with friends. Ethan sat in the corner booth of a quiet coffee shop near the Willamette River, the manila envelope still unopened on the table in front of him. His coffee had gone cold, untouched for the past hour. Outside, Portland carried on with its usual gray rhythm. Cars humming by, people walking their dogs, the distant honk of a boat horn echoing off the water. But inside, time felt like it had slammed to a halt. The words of those children echoed in his mind like a haunting melody. She said you were our dad. It didn't feel real. Ethan had faced hundreds of boardroom showdowns, negotiated billion-dollar mergers, stood unflinching before press conferences and industry critics, but he had no armor for this. 3 8-year-old strangers with his eyes and Clara's fire had called him Dad, and then walked away as if they hadn't just detonated his entire identity. With hesitant fingers, he finally peeled the envelope open. Inside was a single letter, written in Clara's unmistakable handwriting, sharp yet graceful like the woman herself. The first line hit him square in the chest. Ethan, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone and life, once again, didn't turn out the way either of us planned. He swallowed hard and continued reading. Clara's words painted a picture he hadn't expected. She wrote about their breakup and how she had discovered she was pregnant just 2 weeks after leaving. She said she'd sat with the phone in her hand every day for a month, ready to call him, ready to tell him everything. But every time she thought of how he had dismissed her during their last fight, how cold he had been, how he had told her she was just a distraction from his goals, she couldn't do it. She admitted she had feared he would reject the children the way he had seemingly rejected her. I know you're not a bad man, Ethan, she wrote. But you were consumed by your world. And I didn't want to raise our children in a place where they'd always feel second to someone's ambition. So I left you out of it. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe I robbed you of something you didn't even know you wanted. I'm sorry for that. But I hope that one day when you meet them, if you do, you'll understand why I made the choice I did. By the time he reached the last paragraph, Ethan's hands were trembling. She'd told the kids about him. Not as some cruel mystery, but as someone she once loved, someone who had helped make them, someone worth knowing, eventually. Clara had never married again. She'd lived a modest life in Eugene, worked at a community library, homeschooled the triplets in their early years, and later enrolled them in a charter school. Denise, the woman at the cemetery, had helped during her illness. Clara wrote that she didn't want the children thrown into chaos after her death, so she'd arranged for Denise to be their guardian, at least temporarily. The letter ended with a single request. If you're willing to know them, to be there, even a little, I think they'd benefit from it. You have more to offer than you realize. You always did. Don't let fear steal this from you. Ethan folded the letter slowly, placing it back in the envelope like something sacred. His chest ached in a way he wasn't familiar with. All these years he'd been chasing deadlines, investments, international expansions, measuring life by quarterly earnings and growth charts. He thought he had control. Thought he had time. But Clara's death, and now this letter, made him realize how little control he'd ever had. He'd lost 9 years of being a father before he even had the chance. That evening, Ethan walked up to the modest hotel where Denise and the kids were staying. It wasn't fancy, just a clean little place near the outskirts of downtown. He didn't call ahead. He just showed up, unsure of what he'd say, only knowing that walking away now would haunt him more than anything he'd faced in business. Denise opened the door after a soft knock and seemed surprised but not unkind. She nodded and stepped aside to let him in. The room was warm, scattered with signs of children, colored pencils, a puzzle half-finished on the table, a pair of tiny sneakers near the bed. The triplets were sitting cross-legged on the floor playing some card game, but all 3 froze when they saw him. I read your mom's letter, Ethan said quietly. She told me everything. I'm sorry I wasn't there. I didn't know. They said nothing at first, just looked at him with cautious eyes. Then Drew, the boy who had spoken at the grave, asked, "Do you want us now?" The question stabbed deep. Ethan kneeled in front of them. I don't know how to be a dad, he admitted. I don't know what I'm doing. but I want to try. If you'll let me. Riley's face softened, and Sam leaned against Drew as if silently weighing the moment. It wasn't a magical movie scene where everyone rushed in for a hug. But it was something better, real. There was a quiet acceptance in their eyes, a flicker of hope, and for now that was enough. They didn't need perfection. They just needed presence. And Ethan, for the first time in years, realized he wanted to give it. Before going to next, please subscribe our channel, like and share with friends. Ethan woke up the next morning in a hotel room that felt both unfamiliar and strangely comforting. He hadn't returned to his penthouse in Seattle the previous night. Instead, he'd booked the room next to the one where Denise and the kids were staying. He hadn't wanted to be too far, as if putting physical distance between them would make the emotional distance harder to close. For the first time in years, he wasn't rushing to check his emails or answer a call from the board. He was staring at the ceiling, thinking about 3 little humans who carried his blood, yet looked at him like a stranger. He wasn't used to this kind of vulnerability. With his billion-dollar empire, he had control over everything: investments, markets, forecasts. But here, he was simply a man trying to catch up with fatherhood that had happened without his knowledge. And no amount of money could buy him the years he'd lost. At breakfast, Denise brought the kids down to the hotel's small dining area. Ethan had gotten there early, ordering pancakes and scrambled eggs for everyone. The children arrived in silence, their movements cautious. Sam walked in clutching a stuffed penguin that had seen better days. Riley stayed close to Denise, while Drew gave Ethan a polite nod, the kind you give to a new teacher you weren't sure about. They sat across from him, eyeing the food, glancing occasionally at him as if unsure whether this was real or some strange dream. Ethan took a deep breath and decided to break the tension. "I can't make pancakes like these," he said with a small smile. "But I make a mean grilled cheese. Maybe someday I can show you." Sam looked at him with suspicion. "Do you even know how to cook?" The question was honest, not rude. Ethan laughed, caught off guard by how genuine it was. "Barely," he admitted. "But I can follow directions. Sometimes." That cracked the first smile from Riley, a shy little curve of her lips as she reached for her orange juice. They began eating in silence, but the barrier had thinned. Over the course of breakfast, Ethan learned that Drew loved soccer, Riley was obsessed with drawing animals, and Sam had a fascination with airplanes and once tried to build one out of cardboard and rubber bands. Clara had raised them to be curious and thoughtful. She had protected their innocence even as cancer crept into their lives. Denise filled in some of the blanks: how Clara had battled through the chemo without ever letting the kids see her break down, how she'd written letters for their birthdays years in advance, how she made sure they'd never forget the sound of her voice by recording lullabies they still listened to every night. After breakfast, Denise suggested a visit to Washington Park. The weather was surprisingly pleasant for Portland, cool and sunny, and the rose garden was in bloom. Ethan agreed, offering to drive everyone in his rental SUV. On the way there, Sam asked if his car had those cool backseat TVs like the one in Uncle Leo's truck. It didn't. Ethan made a mental note: upgrade next time. When they reached the park, the kids ran ahead toward the rows of rose bushes, and for the first time he saw them just being kids. Laughing, chasing each other, picking petals and pretending they were currency in some wild game they'd invented on the spot. Ethan watched them, a knot of regret tightening in his chest. He had missed their first steps, their first words, their scraped knees and kindergarten tears. Clara had been there for all of it, while he was launching companies and attending galas and jetting off to Asia for product launches. But he couldn't dwell on the years lost. He had to start from where he was now. At some point, Riley wandered back to the bench where Ethan sat. She held out a small pink rose. "You can have this," she said softly. "It's not perfect, but it's pretty." He took it carefully, his eyes stinging. "Thank you," he whispered. "It's beautiful." She nodded and sat beside him, kicking her feet as if pondering something big. "Mom used to say you were really smart. That you could figure out anything like puzzles or machines or computers. Do you think you can figure us out too?" Ethan paused. No amount of corporate strategy had prepared him for that question. "I don't want to figure you out like a puzzle," he said. "I want to know you one day at a time. If that's okay." She looked at him thoughtfully. "Okay. But you should probably know that Sam steals cookies and Drew sometimes fibs about brushing his teeth." She slid off the bench and ran back to her brothers. Ethan laughed, holding the rose like it was made of glass. That afternoon he found himself playing tag and helping the kids climb trees, something he hadn't done since he was a teenager himself. Denise watched from a distance, occasionally exchanging smiles with Ethan. She understood that this wasn't just about parenting, it was about repair, connection, grace. By evening when they returned to the hotel, the kids were visibly more relaxed around him. Sam even asked if Ethan could read them a story. He agreed instantly, surprised by how much he wanted to. In their room, he found an old, worn-out copy of Charlotte's Web on the nightstand. As he read aloud, his voice trembled a little at first, but the kids leaned in, listening closely, their small bodies curled under blankets like puppies in a den. And when the chapter ended, none of them moved. For a moment, it felt like he had always been there. As if time had taken a detour, only to lead him back to where he truly belonged. That night, alone in his room, Ethan stared at the ceiling again. But this time it wasn't with fear or uncertainty. It was with hope. A strange, unfamiliar hope. He knew the road ahead would be messy and emotional and filled with awkward missteps. But he also knew he wouldn't trade it for anything. The children had lost their mother, but maybe, just maybe, they hadn't lost everything. Before going to next, please subscribe our channel, like and share with friends. The next morning brought a rare kind of silence. Ethan woke up earlier than usual, still adjusting to the idea that 3 children existed in the world who were his, and that those children had lost the one person who meant everything to them. The memory of reading Charlotte's Web to them last night was still fresh, especially the moment when Sam fell asleep with his head resting on Ethan's arm, something so innocent yet so heavy with meaning. Ethan had stayed still for a long time after that, not wanting to break the fragile moment. Now, as he dressed and stepped out of his hotel room, he realized that for the first time in over a decade, he was prioritizing something other than work. He wasn't thinking about quarterly reports or global expansions. He was thinking about breakfast with his kids. Downstairs, Denise was already at a table sipping coffee. The kids weren't there yet. "They're still getting ready," she said, offering him a warm but tired smile. "We stayed up late looking at old photo albums. They asked questions about Clara. It was hard, but I think they needed it." Ethan nodded, pulling out a chair. "Thank you, Denise. For everything you've done, for them and for Clara. I don't know how I'll ever repay you." She shook her head. "You don't repay love, Ethan. You show up for it. That's what Clara wanted." Just then the elevator doors opened and out came Drew, Riley and Sam. Sam was wearing mismatched socks, Drew had his shirt inside out, and Riley had a hairbrush tangled in her ponytail. But they all looked more comfortable around Ethan now. Drew gave him a fist bump, Riley gave him a side hug, and Sam, without a word, slid into the chair next to him and started piling scrambled eggs onto his plate. It was messy. It was real. And it felt more genuine than any boardroom meeting Ethan had ever attended. Later that morning, Denise took a phone call from her office and stepped outside, leaving Ethan alone with the kids. "So," he said, rubbing his hands together, "what's the plan? You guys want to go to the zoo? Maybe a movie?" Riley tilted her head. "Can we go to Powell's Books instead? Mom used to take us there and let us each pick one book. Then we'd go to the park and read together." Ethan smiled. "That sounds like a perfect plan." Sam raised an eyebrow. "But you have to read us a story again." Ethan held up a hand. "Deal." They drove to Powell's City of Books in downtown Portland. The place was overwhelming even for adults, with its multi-level maze of bookshelves and genre-labeled rooms. But the kids lit up as soon as they stepped inside. Drew darted toward the sports section, Riley found her way to a display of animal books, and Sam immediately started searching for books about airplanes. Ethan followed them quietly, letting them lead. It struck him how independent they were. Clara had clearly raised them to be thoughtful and curious. He also couldn't help wondering what it would have been like to walk those aisles with her. Would she have teased him for getting lost in the nonfiction section? Would they have argued playfully over which books the kids could buy? He shook the thought away. No use drowning in what's. By the time they reached the checkout counter, each of the kids had picked out a book, and Ethan added a copy of The Phantom Tollbooth to the stack. "It was my favorite growing up," he told them. "A story about how imagination can take you anywhere." They spent the afternoon in a nearby park under a cluster of trees. Drew sprawled on the grass reading about famous soccer players. Riley sat beside Ethan, flipping through her book on rainforest animals, occasionally nudging him with random facts. "Did you know sloths can hold their breath longer than dolphins?" While Sam made airplane noises as he flew, his book around like a glider. It was chaotic. And Ethan had never felt more at peace. As the sun began to set, Ethan realized they'd spent hours just being together. No schedule, no interruptions. It was something he'd never allowed himself before. He reached into the picnic bag Denise had packed and pulled out peanut butter sandwiches, handing them out like a camp counselor. The kids sat cross-legged on the grass, eating and giggling. Sam, with his mouth full, asked suddenly, "Are you gonna leave again?" The question cut through the laughter like a blade. Riley and Drew stopped chewing. Ethan put his sandwich down. "No," he said quietly. "I'm not leaving. I didn't know before. I didn't know about you. But now I do. And I'm here for good. I promise." Riley looked at him, unsure. "What about your job? Don't you have to fly to different countries and go to meetings all the time?" Ethan smiled. "Some things are more important than meetings. I'll make it work. You three are the most important thing to me now." Sam seemed satisfied with that, but Drew looked away, his expression unreadable. It would take time. Trust wasn't built in a day. Ethan knew that. That evening back at the hotel, Denise brought up the idea of school. The kids had been enrolled in a local Portland public school, but with Clara gone, things were uncertain. Ethan offered to help with tuition if they chose private schooling, or even look into hybrid homeschooling programs. But what surprised him was when Drew spoke up. "What if we came to Seattle?" Ethan blinked. "You want to live with me?" Drew nodded slowly. "I mean, eventually, if it's okay. If you want that too." Ethan felt his throat tighten. "I do. Very much." They talked about logistics for a while, timing, school transfers, therapy sessions, routines. Denise agreed to help with the transition but made it clear that the decision would ultimately rest with the kids. Ethan appreciated that. He didn't want to uproot their lives too suddenly. But the possibility of building a home together, an actual home, felt closer than ever. As he tucked them in that night, reading another chapter from Charlotte's Web, he realized something. He wasn't just a visitor in their lives anymore. He was becoming part of the story. Before going to next, please subscribe our channel, like and share with friends. The days that followed in Portland were filled with a strange mix of discovery and quiet heartache. Ethan had extended his stay, postponing meetings in San Francisco and New York, much to the dismay of his assistant, but for once he didn't care. The polished glass walls of his corporate empire could wait, his kids couldn't. Each day with them revealed something new. Drew had a quiet intensity that reminded Ethan of himself when he was young, before ambition had buried his softer edges. Riley was the empath, always attuned to emotions, and fiercely protective of her brothers. Sam was the wild card, unfiltered, curious, and always asking questions like, "Do squirrels get married? And why don't planes have parachutes for every seat?" One afternoon, Ethan took the kids on a walk through Washington Park. The trees were just beginning to turn golden, and the chill in the air made everyone zip their jackets up to their chins. They stopped for hot chocolate at a local cafe, and Ethan watched as the three of them crowded around a small table, laughing over whipped cream mustaches. It was in those small moments, clumsy marshmallow spills and shared giggles, that he began to feel like a father. Not in name but in presence. He was there. And being there, he was learning, meant everything. Later that evening, while the kids were drawing with markers on the hotel notepad, Ethan sat with Denise in the hotel lounge. He looked exhausted but lighter than he had in years. Denise sipped her tea and asked the question that had been quietly looming. "Have you thought about what happens next? When you go back to Seattle?" Ethan sighed. "Every minute. I don't want to rush them, but I also don't want to disappear again. I've missed too much already." Denise nodded, her fingers tracing the rim of her cup. "They're starting to trust you. But it's fragile. They've only known one parent their whole lives. And Clara, well, she made everything feel safe." Ethan swallowed the knot rising in his throat. He thought about Clara often now, her warmth, her conviction, how fiercely she must have protected their children while carrying the weight of his absence. He wasn't angry she hadn't told him. Not anymore. He was only sorry he hadn't looked harder for the truth. That night, while the kids slept, Ethan opened Clara's old journal Denise had given him. Flipping through the pages, he found her notes about each child, how Sam refused to sleep without his red blanket, how Riley once nursed an injured bird for days, and how Drew had asked at age 5 why the moon didn't fall. There were entries about their birthdays, school days, the flu, summer trips to Cannon Beach, and how she'd sometimes cry in the kitchen after they were asleep, wishing Ethan could see them laugh. The words hit him like a punch. She had loved him. So, even in her silence. The next morning, Ethan gathered the kids and asked if they'd like to see Seattle for the weekend. The idea was met with mixed reactions. Drew was cautiously intrigued, Riley was skeptical, and Sam immediately asked if Seattle had more squirrels than Portland. But they agreed. Denise helped pack their things, and Ethan arranged a rental house near Green Lake. A cozy, wood-framed 2-story with a backyard and enough space for everyone to breathe. The drive was quiet at first until Sam demanded they play I Spy, and the mood lightened. They reached Seattle by evening, and Ethan cooked pasta while the kids explored the house. After dinner, Ethan gave them a tour of the neighborhood. They stopped at the lake to skip stones and watched the sky turn a deep blue. Drew asked about the nearby schools and Riley wanted to know if she could grow flowers in the backyard. Ethan realized then they were testing him, not with questions but with interest. They were picturing themselves here. That night, instead of staying in separate rooms, the kids all slept on air mattresses in the living room, insisting they stay close to Ethan. They watched an old animated movie, and all three fell asleep curled under a shared blanket. Ethan didn't dare move them. He just sat nearby, guarding a piece he hadn't known he needed. The weekend passed in a blur of visits to Pike Place Market, the Museum of Pop Culture, and a long stop at the Woodland Park Zoo. The kids asked 1,000 questions. What his work was really like, why he never married again, and if he knew how to ride a bike. Ethan answered every one honestly, even if it meant admitting things that were hard to say. I didn't know how to be a father, he told Riley when she asked why he never came looking. And I didn't know you existed. But I'm here now. And I want to stay. On Sunday night, as they packed to return to Portland for school on Monday, Drew surprised everyone. Can we stay one more day? He asked. Riley nodded slowly. Yeah. I kind of like it here. Sam was already halfway to unpacking his bag. Ethan looked at Denise, who had driven up that morning. She smiled faintly. One more day won't hurt. They're getting comfortable. That night, Ethan watched his children brush their teeth in the upstairs bathroom, giggling and poking each other like siblings who had never known grief. It wasn't perfect. There were still wounds. But there was hope now, living, breathing, noisy, messy hope. Before falling asleep, Drew came into Ethan's room. He hesitated in the doorway, then walked in and sat on the edge of the bed. You're not what I expected, he said. But I'm glad you're not. Ethan looked at him. What did you expect? Drew shrugged. Someone too busy to care. Someone who'd forget our names in a week. Ethan reached out and rested a hand on his son's shoulder. I'll never forget. And I'm not going anywhere. Drew nodded and stood to leave. Good. Because Sam already told his entire class you're a billionaire. So no pressure. Ethan chuckled, the warmth in his chest unfamiliar but welcome. He'd been rich for a long time. But only now did he feel like he had something worth holding on to. Before going to next, please subscribe our channel, like and share with friends. Ethan had never thought walking into a school building would make his heart pound harder than any corporate negotiation. Yet there he stood, just outside Forest Hill Elementary in Portland, trying to calm the storm inside his chest. Monday morning had arrived too quickly. The kids were back in Portland temporarily, but the conversation about moving them to Seattle had officially begun. For now, Ethan wanted to understand their lives fully before making any decisions. Today he was there to pick them up early and meet their teachers. Denise had arranged everything. She had always been the silent force managing chaos behind the scenes, and now Ethan was beginning to see how much Clara had leaned on her too. As he walked through the school hallway, colorful drawings and student essays lined the walls. He saw a paper with Riley's name on it. She had written about her favorite place in the world, home with my brothers even if Sam steals the covers. The classroom door opened and Mrs. Fletcher, Riley's teacher, greeted him warmly. She was in her mid-40s, glasses perched low on her nose, and her expression softened when she saw Ethan. We're all a bit surprised, Mr. Holloway, she said, leading him into the room. Riley never spoke much about her father. Ethan nodded quietly. That's because she didn't know me. Until recently, I didn't even know I had kids. Mrs. Fletcher didn't pry, but her face reflected a quiet understanding. Inside, Riley was hunched over her desk, deep in a math worksheet. When she saw Ethan, her eyes widened and a tiny smile tugged at her lips. You came, she said. Ethan smiled back. Of course I did. You ready? She nodded and quickly packed her things. They made their way to pick up Sam and Drew, who were in adjacent classrooms. Sam barreled into Ethan with full speed, chattering excitedly about recess. Drew gave a smaller, more contained smile but walked close, brushing shoulders with Ethan like he didn't want to admit how much he liked being picked up by a dad. They stopped for ice cream at Salt and Straw, and Ethan listened as they talked about their day. Sam had accidentally glued his fingers together in art class. Riley helped her friend who had a nosebleed. Drew had aced a pop quiz in science. These weren't stories Ethan would have heard over the phone or in a quarterly visit. These were the kinds of things a parent hears when they're present, every day. That night, they stayed at the Portland Hotel again, and Ethan set up a makeshift office on the dining table with his laptop. The kids lay on the couch watching a nature documentary, but their occasional glances at him were full of something new: trust. It wasn't perfect. There were still hesitations. But Ethan could feel something changing. That night, after tucking them in, he sat down with Denise in the hotel lounge again. "I want to talk to a lawyer," he said. "About custody." Denise didn't look surprised. "I figured this would come," she said. "What do you want exactly?" Ethan leaned back. "I want them to live with me. Not right away maybe. But eventually. I want to be in their lives permanently. School birthdays every day. Not a guest appearance once a month." Denise took a long breath. "Clara left no will. There's no legal barrier keeping you from stepping in. But it has to be what they want too. You can't force it. They've had enough disruption." Ethan nodded. "I know. But I don't want to lose more years. They need a home and I want it to be with me." Over the next few days, Ethan hired a family attorney in Portland. Her name was Rachel Monroe and she was direct, experienced and refreshingly honest. "We're not looking at a battle," she told Ethan. "But the court may want to evaluate your readiness. Stability, intent, emotional connection. I'd recommend counseling, for all of you. It shows commitment and it helps, especially for children with sudden transitions." Ethan agreed immediately. He started family therapy sessions that same week. The therapist, a calm and friendly woman named Nora, introduced herself to the kids in a warm space with bean bags and art supplies. The first session was mostly icebreakers and drawings. Sam drew a rocket ship with 4 stick figures inside. Riley drew a house with a garden full of sunflowers. Drew didn't draw, he just sat, watching carefully, like he was trying to decide if this woman was worth talking to. The following week he finally opened up. "I thought he was a stranger," he said during the session. "Now I don't know what he is. It's confusing." Ethan nodded slowly. "It's confusing for me too. But I'm here because I want to understand, not just visit." As the weeks rolled on, something unexpected happened. Drew started texting Ethan during the school day. Riley began keeping a list of questions to ask him every evening. Sam, ever the energetic soul, started calling him Dad when he forgot to say Ethan. And Ethan? He changed. His assistant in Seattle noticed he scheduled fewer late-night meetings. His board noticed he turned down 2 international deals. But Ethan didn't care. He had spent a decade building empires. Now he was building something that actually mattered. A family. One morning as they walked to the car, Riley slipped her hand into his without saying a word. Just a quiet touch. Ethan looked down and gave a small squeeze. It was enough. By the time winter approached, Ethan had rented a home in Portland, closer to the school. He wanted to be near them while they adjusted. Every Friday they had movie night. Every Sunday they visited the park or museum or just made pancakes together. The house was small compared to his Seattle mansion, but it was warm, alive, full of drawings on the fridge and laughter bouncing off the walls. Ethan no longer felt like an outsider. He was becoming the father Clara would have wanted him to be. And for the first time in years he didn't feel alone. Before going to next, please subscribe our channel, like and share with friends. The first snow of the season had dusted the streets of Portland, leaving a soft blanket over rooftops and tree branches. Ethan stood by the window of the small rental house, sipping coffee, watching Sam try to catch snowflakes on his tongue in the front yard. Riley was carefully placing pine cones and twigs into a line to create what she called a winter forest, while Drew shoveled a clear path to the mailbox with quiet focus. It was hard to believe only a few months ago these kids were complete strangers to him. Now they were the rhythm of his days, the reason he looked forward to mornings. The air in the house smelled of cinnamon and toast. Denise had dropped by earlier to help with school projects, and now the house was filled with glue sticks, markers, glitter, and poster boards. Ethan had cleared his business schedule for the entire week leading up to Christmas break. He wasn't going back to Seattle for the holidays. He wanted to spend every second with them. Later that day, while walking through Powell's City of Books downtown, Drew wandered off into the history section. Ethan found him flipping through a book about American railroads. "You like this stuff?" Ethan asked, peering over his shoulder. Drew shrugged, then nodded. "Mom said Grandpa used to work on the trains. I wanted to see what it was like." Ethan smiled and bought the book without a second thought. At the counter, Riley picked out a book on space and Sam insisted on a joke book titled 101 Fart Jokes. Ethan paid for them all. These little moments, bookstore trips, late-night cocoa, arguing over whether pineapples belonged on pizza, had begun to mean more to Ethan than all his billion-dollar deals. At night, as the kids dozed off, he sat in the quiet living room looking at old pictures of Clara on his phone. He found one where she was laughing, mid-blink, flour on her cheek from baking. It struck him like a wave, the years lost, the words unspoken, the truth she had kept to herself. One evening, after putting the kids to bed, Ethan asked Denise if Clara had ever tried to reach him. They were sitting in the kitchen, the only light coming from under the microwave. Denise hesitated, then nodded. Once. About 6 years ago. She had a letter ready to send. I remember because she stayed up all night writing it. Ethan's eyebrows lifted. And then? She changed her mind the next morning, Denise said quietly. She was afraid you'd come in, take over, maybe fight her for custody or abandon them all over again. She couldn't take that chance. Ethan rubbed his hands over his face. I wish I could have told her. I would have done better. I just didn't know. Denise gave him a tired smile. Now you do. That's all that matters. The conversation left a weight on Ethan's chest that lingered into the next few days. He kept thinking about that letter. Somewhere out there was a version of Clara who had tried to connect, who had wanted to bridge the distance. By Christmas Eve, the house was glowing with string lights. Riley had made her own ornaments. Sam insisted on putting the star on top, standing on Drew's back in a dangerous, wobbling moment that ended with everyone in fits of laughter. Ethan cooked dinner, burning the ham slightly but rescuing the mashed potatoes with help from YouTube videos. They sat around the table and played a game where everyone had to say what they were grateful for. Sam said, "My warm bed and extra gravy." Riley said, "Books and snow and my new toothbrush that plays music." Drew looked at Ethan, then quietly said, "Having someone who came back." Ethan had to look away quickly to blink the tears back. After they went to bed, Ethan sat up alone, scrolling through his inbox. There, among hundreds of emails, was one from Clara. It was over 8 years old, unopened. The subject line said simply, "Read when you're ready." His breath caught in his throat. He clicked it open. The message wasn't long. It was written like a confession. She said she hadn't told him everything because she didn't know how. That the twins were his, and that by the time she had gained the courage to reach out, too much time had passed and the world had changed. She wrote that the triplets were smart, funny, stubborn, and loud. She wrote that if someday he ever found them, he should know they weren't a mistake. They were her whole world. And maybe one day they could be his too. Ethan sat there, the screen glowing softly, his heart full of things he couldn't put into words. The next morning, Christmas arrived with squeals of joy. The kids tore open their gifts, skateboards, books, and puzzles. Sam screamed when he saw a basketball hoop waiting in the yard. Drew smiled quietly at a telescope. Riley hugged a necklace Ethan had gotten engraved with a sunflower, Clara's favorite flower. They spent the entire day playing, eating, and laughing. That night, Ethan sat them down on the couch. He told them about the email. About their mother's letter. About how he never got to say goodbye to her, but how he would spend the rest of his life saying yes to them. "You don't have to call me Dad if you're not ready," he said. "But I want you to know I'm not going anywhere." For a moment the room was still. Then Riley reached over and hugged him tightly. Sam leaned his head on his shoulder. Drew, always the quiet one, nodded. "Dad's fine," he whispered. Ethan's eyes welled up. It wasn't just a word. It was a homecoming. One that had taken 8 long years, a funeral, a snowstorm, and 3 children who didn't know they had a father. But now they did. And he wasn't letting go. Winter passed slowly in Portland, with more rainy days than sunny ones, but inside the little rental house, the warmth never faded. Ethan found a rhythm in parenting that he hadn't known he could achieve. Mornings started with mismatched socks, cereal spilled across the counter, and sometimes a meltdown over who got the red spoon. But even the chaos carried a strange peace. The kids were settling in, not just to the house but to the idea that Ethan wasn't a visitor anymore. He was showing up every day, helping with homework, packing lunches, and even volunteering once a week at their school, something he never imagined doing when he was closing deals in boardrooms at his Seattle office. He had finally hired a general manager to run day-to-day operations at his company, freeing himself to stay in Portland indefinitely. No more flights back and forth. No more excuses. One Friday afternoon he took the kids to the Oregon Museum of Science and Industry. Riley spent hours in the planetarium, whispering star names like secrets. Drew was fascinated by the earthquake simulator while Sam got stuck, quite literally, in the giant submarine play tunnel. Watching them navigate this world with such wonder made Ethan realize how much he had missed. He wasn't just catching up on lost time, he was building something new with them. Something real. After the museum, they had dinner at a food truck lot downtown, eating tacos under string lights, wrapped in scarves and beanies. Sam spilled hot sauce on his jeans and Drew offered him his own napkin without a word. Ethan quietly watched that small act of kindness, his heart swelling. But not everything came easily. One evening, Drew came home with a bruised cheek and a cracked phone screen. When Ethan asked what had happened, Drew shrugged it off and retreated to his room. Later, after the twins had gone to bed, Ethan knocked softly and sat down beside him. Drew hesitated, then finally spoke. "A kid at school called me a mistake. Said I probably didn't even have a dad." Ethan's chest tightened. "What did you say?" Drew looked down. "Nothing. I just walked away. I didn't want to cry in front of everyone." Ethan put his arm around him. "You're not a mistake. Not even close. I didn't know about you before, but now I do. And I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." Drew leaned into him, silent, but his breathing slowed. It was a moment that said more than words could. A few weeks later, Denise called with news. Clara's mother, Lorraine, had asked to meet Ethan. She hadn't attended Clara's funeral. Her health had been declining and she'd been in assisted living for the past year. Ethan wasn't sure what to expect, but he agreed. They drove to a quiet nursing home in Eugene, a couple of hours south. The air smelled of disinfectant and warm soup, and Lorraine sat in a recliner, frail but alert. She looked at Ethan like she was reading every regret etched on his face. After a long silence, she said, "You look just like the man Clara used to cry about." Ethan lowered his eyes. "I didn't know about them," he said softly. "And I'm sorry I wasn't there for her." Lorraine nodded. "I know. She was scared. But she never stopped loving you." That hit harder than he expected. They sat in silence for a while before she added, "You're doing better than I thought you would." "They seem happy." Ethan smiled. "They've changed everything." Back in Portland, life continued with slow and beautiful changes. Riley joined a school play and cast herself as the moon, insisting she needed glittery shoes to shine properly. Ethan helped her rehearse her one line, "Even in the dark, I glow," until she could say it with confidence. Sam became obsessed with basketball, dribbling in the hallway until he broke a lamp. Ethan didn't even scold him. Instead, they cleared space in the garage and set up a proper hoop. Drew started writing not stories or essays but letters, to Clara. He showed Ethan one written in neat cursive. "Dear Mom," it began, "Dad's here now. Feels weird saying that, but it also feels good. I think you'd be proud." One rainy Sunday morning, the family visited Clara's grave again. Ethan brought flowers, Riley placed a drawing she made, and Sam placed a mini basketball next to the headstone. Drew stood quietly, then whispered, "Thank you." On the way back they stopped for hot chocolate. No one said much, but it was a peaceful kind of quiet. A silence that didn't need to be filled. That night, after the kids were asleep, Ethan looked around at their small home. Toys scattered on the carpet, art taped to the fridge, a stack of children's books on the coffee table. He had lived in penthouses, owned beachfront mansions, flown private jets. But nothing compared to this messy, noisy, love-filled life. The next day Denise showed up with news. The lease on the house was ending in 3 months, and the owner wasn't renewing. Ethan didn't panic. Instead he smiled. "Good," he said. "It's time we find a place that's really ours." They began house hunting around Portland, including nearby neighborhoods like Lake Oswego and Beaverton. The kids got excited, making lists of things they wanted: a treehouse, a room painted purple, a dog. Ethan promised nothing, but inside he was dreaming too. Dreaming of a real home. One with creaky floors and photo frames and memories that belonged to all of them. Ethan sat on the porch of their new house in Lake Oswego, watching the sunset over the trees. The sound of the kids laughing in the backyard filled the air, a sound he had grown so accustomed to in the months since they had moved in. He hadn't imagined this kind of life when he was still living in the high-rise apartments of Seattle, absorbed in his business world. Now he had a little yard, a creaky house with history, and 3 kids who had claimed every corner of it as their own. The house felt right in a way he never thought possible. It wasn't about the size or the money he'd spent on renovations. It was the way the children had transformed it. Riley's drawings were taped to the walls, Sam's basketball gear was always strewn across the living room, and Drew had set up a small library corner, stacking books high on shelves that Ethan had custom built for him. He thought about how Clara would have loved it, how proud she would be to see the kids thriving in this new life. It had been nearly 6 months since they moved in, and Ethan couldn't have asked for better progress with the kids. There had been moments of doubt, of course. Moments when the challenges of fatherhood felt overwhelming, especially given the years of absence. There were still awkward silences, uncertain conversations, and sometimes a quiet ache in his chest when he thought about how much he'd missed. But the good moments, the small victories, outweighed them. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. Drew was still reserved, often retreating into his own world of books and journals, but Ethan could see the changes. The slight smiles, the way he opened up during their movie nights. Riley, with her infectious energy, had flourished in school, her teachers constantly praising her enthusiasm. Sam, the youngest, still had his mischief streak, but he had found his rhythm, and his confidence in sports had become something of a quiet pride. One afternoon, after a long week of meetings and catching up on work, Ethan decided to take the kids out for a surprise trip. They piled into the car, Riley in the front seat, Sam bouncing in the back, and Drew as always quietly looking out the window. Ethan drove out to the Columbia River Gorge, a place he had visited often during his childhood. The sun was shining, the air crisp, and the landscape stretched endlessly with towering cliffs, waterfalls, and lush greenery. The moment they arrived, Riley was the first to jump out, racing toward the trail that led to the famous Multnomah Falls. Sam, always ready for an adventure, followed quickly, leaving Drew to walk alongside Ethan, both of them more subdued, but enjoying the scenery in their own way. As they reached the base of the falls, Ethan looked at Drew, who had been quieter than usual. "What's on your mind?" he asked, half expecting Drew to dismiss the question. But instead Drew shrugged. "It's just, this place. It's peaceful. Like, I didn't know this kind of beauty was real." Ethan smiled, placing a hand on Drew's shoulder. "Sometimes, we all need to see things for the first time, even if they've always been there." They spent the rest of the day exploring, with Riley leading the charge, and Sam eagerly taking every opportunity to climb rocks or race ahead. When they stopped for a break, sitting on a blanket near the river, Ethan found himself reflecting on the changes in his own life. He had never been an outdoors person. He had preferred the comfort of city living, the convenience of fine dining and high-end restaurants. But here, in the presence of his children, something had shifted inside him. He no longer craved the luxuries he had once considered essential. Instead, the simple moments with his family, like watching the kids run around in the sun or listening to their laughter echo through the trees, felt like the true riches of life. By the time they returned home, the kids were exhausted but happy. They had stories to tell, sketches of the waterfalls to show, and even a few wildflowers to add to their collection. Ethan, as always, lingered for a moment, just watching them interact. There was a sense of normalcy now that he hadn't dared to dream of when he first met them. He had come into their lives as an outsider, unsure of his place, unsure if he could ever truly make up for the years of absence. But now it felt different. It felt like they were all becoming a real family, even if it had started in the most unexpected way. But life had a way of reminding Ethan that things were not always smooth. A week later the letter arrived. He had been expecting it. He knew that one day the legal documents regarding Clara's estate would come. What he hadn't anticipated was the weight of it. The letter was from a lawyer, explaining that it was time to finalize the division of Clara's assets. There were the usual questions about ownership of the house, the distribution of personal items, and of course the custody of the children. Ethan had already taken steps to ensure that he had legal rights as their guardian, but the process still felt like an intrusion on the new life they had built. It wasn't just paperwork, it was the final confirmation that Clara was truly gone, and that he, not she, was the one holding the future for these kids. Ethan sat at the kitchen table, the letter unopened, his mind racing with thoughts. He wasn't afraid of the responsibility. He had embraced it, learned to love it even, but he still felt the weight of his past decisions. He wondered if there would always be a part of him that felt like an outsider, or if one day he would finally feel like he had truly earned his place in their lives. Later that evening, when the kids were in bed, he found himself staring at the stars, lost in thought. It had been a long road to get here. But for the first time he felt at peace with the journey. He was where he needed to be, with the people who mattered most. Ethan had always been a man of reason. His life, driven by calculations, profits, and the rigid structure of business, had not prepared him for the unpredictability of fatherhood. Yet, here he was, sitting in the quiet of their living room, the faint glow of the TV illuminating his face. The kids were asleep, their rooms now filled with the remnants of a busy day, crumpled papers, toys scattered across the floor, and an old doll Riley had been carrying around for the past week. It had been a whirlwind these past several months. He still remembered the hesitation, the uncertainty that had plagued him when he first moved to Lake Oswego. Could he ever truly fit into this new life? Could he really replace the absence of Clara, the woman who had been not just his wife but the glue holding everything together? As he sat there, lost in thought, a soft knock on the door brought him back to reality. He stood up slowly, making his way to the door, surprised at the late hour. Opening it, he was greeted by a familiar face, Sarah, his lawyer. Her tired eyes softened as she noticed him. "Ethan, I hope I'm not disturbing you," she said quietly, holding a file in her hand. He stepped aside, motioning for her to come in. "It's late, Sarah. What's going on?" he asked, already feeling a knot tighten in his stomach. He had been bracing for this moment, but the file in her hand told him it was time. "I'm sorry to bring this up now, but it's about Clara's estate. We've reached the final stage," she said, setting the file down on the coffee table. Ethan sat down, his heart racing. It felt surreal. The whole process had dragged on for months, but now, with everything nearing completion, the reality of it all was setting in. Clara was gone, and the world he had built with her, the life they had shared, was now just a collection of memories. "There's something you need to know, Ethan," Sarah continued, her tone more serious than usual. "The documents are all in order. The house, the investments, everything is legally yours as per Clara's wishes." Ethan nodded, but there was no sense of relief. It was as if the paperwork didn't matter anymore. What mattered were the children, and the void that would always exist where Clara once stood. She had been their mother, their caretaker, their guiding force. Now, it was on him to fill those shoes, to step into a role he never thought he'd be ready for. As he sat there, the weight of the situation crashed down on him like a tidal wave. Sarah continued, "But there's one final piece of information, Ethan. It's about the trust Clara set up for the kids. You've already been named their guardian, but there are provisions in the trust that require your attention. Specifically, it addresses their future, schooling, healthcare, everything. You'll need to manage it, but there's one condition." Ethan furrowed his brow. "What condition?" Sarah hesitated for a moment before speaking. Clara made it very clear that the children's future was her top priority. She included a clause in the trust that requires you to fulfill one thing before accessing the full inheritance. Ethan leaned forward, intrigued. "What is it?" "It's simple really," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "She wanted you to prove to yourself that you could be a father, not just in name but in every sense of the word. She wanted you to be fully present in their lives, to show them that you could be their constant, their protector. That you could be the parent they needed, the one they could count on. Until you do that, you won't have access to the full trust." Ethan sat back, processing the words. He had always thought of himself as a responsible man, a man who could handle any challenge thrown his way. But this was different. Clara had known him too well. She knew that, despite his success in the corporate world, he had never truly embraced the responsibilities of fatherhood. Not in the way she had. Not in the way she had balanced work and family with such grace. The next morning, as the sun filtered through the kitchen window, Ethan found himself standing in front of the kids' rooms. He had been up early, his mind racing with everything Sarah had said. He looked down at the breakfast table, where Riley was busy coloring, Sam was eating his cereal with an exaggerated slowness, and Drew, as always, was reading a book. The normalcy of it all struck him. It was so simple, so effortless for them. They didn't need fancy things, grand gestures, or even the constant reassurance that he loved them. They needed his presence, his time, and his attention. "Hey guys," Ethan said, pulling up a chair. "How's everyone feeling this morning?" Riley looked up, her eyes bright. "I'm making a picture for you, Daddy. It's a castle with dragons and knights." She handed him the drawing, and Ethan smiled, touched by her innocence. "I'm just gonna practice my basketball shots after school," Sam chimed in, grinning. "I'm gonna beat Drew this time for sure." Drew, never one for competition, simply looked up from his book and gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. "Good luck with that." Ethan chuckled, but inside his heart swelled. This was what he had been fighting for. This was what he had come to realize mattered most. It wasn't the money, the estate, or even the trust. It was them, their little moments, their laughter, their love. He spent the rest of the day with them, taking them to the park, playing basketball with Sam, and reading books with Drew. He knew there were still challenges ahead, and that the weight of responsibility would never completely lift. But for the first time in a long time, Ethan felt something he had never felt before. A sense of peace. He wasn't just doing this for the money or because it was his duty. He was doing this because he loved them and he wanted to be the father they deserved. Months passed and Ethan kept his promise to Clara. He stayed present, involved, and committed. The kids thrived under his care, and while there were still tough days, the bond between them grew stronger. He didn't need a piece of paper or a legal document to tell him he was a father. He knew it in his heart. One day, as he sat on the porch watching the sunset with Riley, Sam, and Drew, he realized something. Clara had been right. It wasn't about the inheritance, the house, or the legacy. It was about the love they shared, the life they had built together, and the memories they had yet to create. Ethan had finally found what he had been looking for all along. His family. If you've liked this story, please subscribe our channel, like and share with friends.